If you're looking for a short yet relatively complex project for your portfolio, this credit card input is the perfect project. The CSS and JavaScript that goes into it is a lot more complex than it may look, especially to get that four-part input to work properly. And in this video, I'm going to show you exactly how to create this. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name's Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. And today I'm going to show you how to build this credit card input that you saw at the beginning of this video. Now, I do want to mention the way I got the inspiration for this video is actually from this CodePen. I'll link it in the description for you as well. But as you can see, they have these really cool credit card inputs, and I wanted to try to create this myself without actually using their code. So all of the code in this video is my own, but I use this as inspiration. As you can see, our input for our credit card looks very similar to their input on this red one down here. Now, the actual way this input's going to work is a little bit more confusing than you may think because of this four-part input right here. For example, if I just remove some values from here and I start typing right here with a bunch of ones, once I fill this up, it should now push everything to the right, as you see it is doing. So making that type of implementation work, same thing with like backspace, it should move across the different rows. All of that different interaction is fairly complex, and it's going to be covered in the second half of this video. And the first half of this video is all about the styling of this credit card to give it the look that we want. So to get started with that, we first need to look at our HTML. So let's come in here, just get some boilerplate HTML using Emmet. If you're unfamiliar with Emmet, I'll link it in the cards and description for you so you can figure out how to use Emmet. It just makes coding a lot quicker. And what we want to do inside of here is to create a form for our credit card input. So we're going to create a form and we're going to give it the class of credit card. And this form right here is essentially just going to be the entire credit card. We're just using a form because we have inputs inside of here, so it makes sense that it is a form. Now inside of our credit card, we're going to have two different sections. We have this front section, which contains most of the information, and then a back section for that CVC number that we have right here. So what I need to do inside of here is I need to have those different specifications. So for our form, we're going to have front, and we're going to come and we're going to do the exact same thing for a back side. Now inside the front side, we're going to have a few different groups of information. We're going to have this title at the top as well as this logo. So let's create a row for that. We're just going to call it card data row. And inside of here, we're going to have our brand name. And this in our case is WDS Bank. And then we're going to have our image, which our image is just going to be here, a class of logo. And for our source, let's just say visa.svg. That's an SVG that we're going to have to bring in. Now, if you want to use the same SVGs that I'm using, I'm going to have them in the GitHub repository, linked down in the description below. But for now, I'm just going to copy over the two different images we're going to use. And again, if you want these exact images, you can get them in the GitHub repository linked in the description down below. So now with that done, we just have our Visa logo right here, and then we have a class of logo on that. So if I just save and we look at our results over here, you'll notice nothing is showing up. And that's because this Visa logo by default is a white color. As you can see over here, it has that white color. If we change this to MasterCard, for example, and save, we should see that MasterCard logo, but we are not. So I'm just going to restart live server, which is an extension that I use to make everything show up live when I make changes. Reopen that with live server, and hopefully that should actually fix our problem. There we go, that fixed the problem, and we can just get rid of this folder that it created. We don't need that. Okay, so now we have our MasterCard logo. Let's just change it back to that Visa logo. And again, it's white, which is why you can't see it, but that's perfectly okay. So now the next thing we need to do, if we just come over here, we can look at the different things we need to do. And we need to add in our card number inputs, our name input, as well as our expiration. So down below our card data row, let's do that. And to do the card number, we're going to actually use something called a field set. And a field set is essentially a way to group together different inputs. And this is purely for screen readers, just to make it clear that all four of these inputs are for the same exact thing. That's all that this field set is going to be doing for us. And a legend inside a field set is essentially like the label for the different inputs. In our case, our label is our card number, because we want to have these different inputs be associated with our card number. Also for our field set, I'm going to give it a class of form group. And this will just allow us to style our different form elements. As you can see, we have all these different inputs with labels. They're all going to be styled using the same styling. So I'm going to give them all the same class. Now also we need our label, and our label here is going to have a for. We're going to call it CC1. That's going to be our credit card number input number 1 right there. And inside of here, we're just going to put card number. Now you may be wondering why we have a legend and a label, and again, this is all for accessibility purposes. We want to make sure that it's as clear as possible what these different inputs are doing, so we're making sure to give them a label and a legend. Now if I save this and I come over here, you can see that our legend is showing up inside of our field set, and then we have our label inside that box. Now inside of here, we need to have our different inputs. So I'm going to come in here, I'm going to create a div, I'm going to give it a class of CC inputs, and that's just going to be for our different credit card inputs. And inside of here, I'm going to put our different inputs. Now our inputs are going to have a lot of really important information. For example, the type, there is no like credit card number type. So I like to use the telephone number type because telephone numbers can only have essentially numbers. So this just makes it a little bit easier to write out a credit card, because if you use the number format, it has things like decimal points and negative numbers, which credit cards obviously cannot have. Now we're also going to set a max length. So we can come in here, say max length is going to be 4. We can set an area label, and this again is going to be for screen readers. I just wanted to say credit card first 4 digits. So this is just saying, hey, this input is for the first 4 digits of our credit card. Then I want to give this a name, which in our case is CC1. That's going to be linked up with this label here. So if I click on this credit card name right here, for example, if I just close this off and I click on this input label, it should be focusing inside of my input, but I need to make sure I also give it an ID of CC1. This name here is actually not even important. I can completely get rid of that. Now when I click here, you can see it's inside of this card number section. Now it's still letting me put numbers and such inside of it, or I'm sorry, letters. We're going to need to fix that in a little bit, but that's okay for now. Now the other thing I want to do is I want to make sure that this is required. So I can say required. And I'm also going to set a pattern on here, and this is just a regular expression pattern, and I want to say everything is going to be between 0 and 9. I also specifically want to make sure there are 4 numbers, so this pattern is saying there are 4 numbers 0 to 9, and that is perfect. Now if I give that a quick save, we have 1 input, but we obviously need 4 inputs. So I'm going to copy this input down 3 total times, so now we have 4 of them, and again I'm just going to be saying credit card second 4 digits, third 4 digits, fourth 4 digits, or we could just say last 4, I guess. We don't need an ID on any of these because we're only using the ID for the label of this first one, so we can remove that. And now we have our 4 different inputs, and all of them only allow us to enter 4 different numbers in them, which is what we want. Now, if we go back over to our working example here, you can see now we have a row which contains 2 inputs side by side, our name and our expiration. So I'm going to put those inside of their own div. And this div is just going to be called input row. So we know this is a row for our inputs. And now what I want to do is I want to have 2 different sections, one for the name and one for the expiration. We'll do the name first because that's the easiest. We'll give it a class of form group as well as the class of name group, because the styles for our name are going to be slightly different. We need to make sure this input expands to fill the full space. So that's what this name group class is going to allow us to do. Now the next thing I want to do inside of here is I want to give us a label, and this label is going to be for our name input, and it's going to say name. And then we're going to need to create an input here, and this input has an ID of name, and we should make this required as well. So now we just have these things hooked up, so when I click on the label, it properly highlights inside of my input. I want to do the expiration date as well, and that's going to again be inside of a field set, but it's going to be inside this row. So we're going to create a field set, and this field set is going to have a class here of form group. And now inside this field set, we essentially need 1 label, and we're going to need 2 different inputs. So we're going to use our legend just like we've been doing before. This will say expiration, and then we're going to create a label. This label is going to be for our expiration month because that's the first thing. So if I click here, I want it to highlight inside of this select section, and I want it to just say expiration, just like that. Then I'm going to have a div that's going to contain these different inputs, exactly like what I did up here. So it's going to be pretty much the exact same thing, but this one here is going to have a class of horizontal input stack. And this class we should also apply to our credit card inputs because they also are going to be a horizontal stack. So we're going to give that same class up here as well. So now we know that both of these are horizontal stacks that are going to look essentially exactly the same. Now inside of our div, we essentially need to have 2 different selects. So I want to have a select here. And this select, we don't really need to worry about the name, but for the ID, we want this to say expiration month. And we're going to give it an aria labeled by. And this aria labeled by here, I'm sorry, not labeled by, just label. This label here is going to be expiration month, again, for screen reader purposes. And it's going to be required. And inside of here, we're going to need a bunch of different options. For example, 0, 1, and then we just need to count up. So we have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There we go. We just have 1 for each month, essentially. So now if I come over here, you can see we have an input that goes 0 all the way to 12. That looks super good. Now the last thing we need to do is have an input for our year. In JavaScript, we're going to dynamically add the years in here because we only accept credit cards with expirations in the future. So we'll make sure to dynamically create this for future dates. But for now, we're just going to hard code it because we don't have the JavaScript ready right now. So I'm just going to copy our select because it's going to be very similar. Our select here is going to be an expiration year. Our label is going to say year instead of month. And inside of our options, we're going to have things like 2022, 2023, and so on. For now, I'm just going to put two options because, again, we're going to dynamically generate this using JavaScript. Now, if we just look at our card, you can see that that is everything on the front-facing section of our card. So now we can move to the back section, which is much simpler. There's very few things on the back, so this will be pretty easy. First, we have this black line. I'm just going to call it a stripe. So we're going to have a div with the class of stripe to implement that shape. Then we're going to have our form group. And this form group is also going to have a class of CVC group, just because it's going to need some special styling to position it in the correct location. So we're going to have to use those special styles. That's why we gave it a class. Next, we're going to have a label for our CVC. And we're going to need to have an input that lines up with that. And this input here is going to have the type of tel. Again, same thing for telephone. We're going to have a max length here, which is going to be 3, because a CVC is always going to be a length of 3. And then I need to give it an ID that matches our for element of CVC. So with that right there, we should have everything that we need done for all of our different inputs. And it looks like everything is working properly. Obviously, it's super ugly, but we can style that next. Also, I want to make sure this input here is required. We can just close that off. So now we have everything that we need done for our HTML. We can move on to our CSS. So let's create a style sheet, styles.css. And let's make sure we link that in our HTML at the very top. We can just come up here. Whoops. Link styles.css. Now inside of here, the very first thing that I want to do is style all the sizing and coloring for my credit card so we can fit everything else into place. So to do that, we'll just come in here, we'll select our credit card. And we know for a fact that the color of all of our text is white, so we can set the color to white. Our font family we're going to use is Arial. And then for position, we're going to use position relative because we're going to need to absolutely position this back section so it shows up behind our front section. Now with that done, we can work on styling out our different colors. So we're going to select our front and our back because they're going to share a lot of the same styles because they're going to be the same exact size and the same exact color. So our background color, we can come in here, which is going to be 200, 80%, and 30% using HSL. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this HSL format, I have a full video covering it. I'll link in the cards and description for you. But essentially, it's a way to create our colors. And as you can see, we now have our blue background. It's super ugly right now, but that's perfectly okay. The next thing I want to do is I want to specify a border using that same HSL hue and the exact same saturation. I just want to make it quite a bit darker. So I'm going to lower the lightness down to 10%. The next thing we're going to do is add some rounded corners. So we're going to have a border radius 0.5 rem. And now we're going to hard code our size. We're going to say our width is going to be 325 pixels. And our height here is 150 pixels. And our padding here, 0.75 rem and 1 rem. Now, if we give that a quick save and come over here, you can see we have two rounded sections. There is some space between them. I mean, if we give a little margin, we can see some space between them. There we go. So now you can see the space between them. Obviously, it doesn't look right. Everything's overflowing, but that's okay for now. We just have two credit card shaped icons. And the reason we need to hard code all of our spacing, or of our width and our height and so on, is just to make it so that they're perfectly shaped like a credit card. Now, the last thing I want to do is add some extra padding on the bottom of 1.25 rem. And the reason for that is just, I want the space on the top to simulate about the same amount of space on the bottom. So that extra spacing is just going to make sure that it happens. Now, the next thing that I want to work on is this data row section, because right now our logo is massive. We should probably shrink that down. I'm going to come in here, select the credit card, and I want to get that card data row. That's the class I gave for that. I'm going to give it a display of flex, and a margin bottom here is going to be auto. And what I'm going to do on top of that is I'm going to select our credit card front. And I'm going to set here the display to flex. And I want to say my flex direction is going to be column. Now, what I've essentially done by making this element a display of flex and given a margin bottom auto on its child is I've made it so all the extra space in our credit card is going to be pushed between our different elements. So this margin bottom auto here just means that all the extra space in this card is going to be put right here in between these two different elements. And if you're unfamiliar with this margin bottom auto or just margin auto in general, I have a full video covering how it works within Flex containers. I'll link in the description and cards for you. Now, to clean up our styles a little bit more, I also want to come in here, say we're going to have a gap of 1 rem that's going to space out all of our different elements inside of here, as well as I want to give it a z index of 1 so it can appear over top of our back, an overflow of hidden, and then a position of relative. That'll just make spacing things out so much better. So if I give that a quick save, you can now see already all that extra overflow has been removed, which looks better, but still we have more styling to do. So let's get working on that logo because it's still massive. So I want our logo to have a width of 40 pixels and a height of 50 pixels and a flex grow of 0 just so it doesn't get any larger. And there we go. You can now see that we have our Visa logo right here. The next thing I want to work on is going to be for our brand name. So our credit card brand name, that's that WDS Bank. I want the flex grow on this to be 1, so it's going to essentially fill the entire size, pushes our Visa logo to the right. I want to increase our font size. We'll do like 1.25 REM, and I want to make it a bold font, so we'll use a font weight of bold. Now our logo doesn't quite look the right size, so I think I swapped my height and my width. I swap those background. Okay, there we go. We can see my logo's increased in size the way I want it to. I want the width to be larger than the height. Now that we have our top row done, it looks pretty much exactly the same as over here. The next thing we can work on is all of our different form elements themselves. So the very first thing we can do is select our credit card, and we can select our form groups because each one of our inputs are inside of a form group. I want to change the display to flex, the flex direction to column, and I want to change the gap to 0.25 REM. That's going to give us space between all of our different labels and the elements inside of them, which is great. The next thing I want to do is I want to get the field sets that we have. I want to essentially remove all the styles. So border none, adding 0, margin 0. And if we just come over here, give that a quick save, you can see that removes a lot of those extra styles we don't really care about. Now another thing I want to do is remove the legend. So I can come in here, I can come with my field set, I can get the legend, and I could say display of none, and that would remove it. But the problem with doing that is I want this to still be there for screen readers so that they can know what the actual thing is part of. So instead of a display of none, I'm going to change visibility to hidden. I'm going to change the height here to 0, the width to 0, the position here to absolute, and I'm going to change the top to -200 view height. Essentially, all that does is it acts like display none by hiding the element, by making it so the height and width is 0, and the position absolute and the top -200 just puts it way off the screen. So essentially, the element is still there for screen readers, but for people that are looking at the site, they can never see it and can never interact with it. Now, the next thing to work on is our horizontal input stacks. So let's come in here with our credit card, get our horizontal input stack. And we know that what we want to do is we want to use a display of flex and a gap of 0.5 REM. And that's just going to put all of our inputs in a horizontal line next to each other if they have that class. Now for our credit card inputs in particular, we gave those a class of credit card inputs. I want to select each input and I want to change the width to 4CH and I want to change the font family to monospace. Now this is some interesting code what this does. So a width of 4CH stands for 4 characters. Essentially I want it to be as wide as 4 individual characters, and you can see if I type in 4 characters, that essentially fills the entire space inside of my input. The CH unit I think is based on the width of a 0, but since we're using a monospace font, a 0 and a 1 have the exact same width, so it really doesn't matter what character it uses for the width. I believe it is a 0 though. And the reason we're doing a monospace font is just because on most credit cards, a monospace font is used, so it just kind of matches up with what credit cards would look like. Now I also want to add some specific styles to my inputs, so we're going to select our inputs as well as our, select elements. What I want to do is I want to change our padding to be 0.25 EM and 0.5 EM, as well as our border should be none, and our border radius should be 0.25 EM. And if we give that a quick save, you can now see we have these rounded inputs with a little bit extra space. The last thing I want to do is I want to change my appearance to none. All that does is it's going to remove the caret symbol on select boxes. So as you can see here, we don't have those caret symbols. It just looks a little bit cleaner in my opinion. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to select our credit card here, and I want to get each one of our labels. I want to reduce the font size because it's pretty large. So we'll say 0.65 REM. And also I want to do a text transform. This is a really cool CSS property, which allows you to convert all the text to something like uppercase or lowercase. In our case, uppercase looks really good. So now with that done, we can move on to our input row. Because we have that input row, we want it to be side by side. Easiest way to do that is with a display of flex and a gap of 2 REM to space them out. Now as you can see, our name here and our expiration section, they are spaced out from each other, but on the same line. And you'll notice our select elements here do not have that drop down arrow. If we remove that appearance of none, you can see now those drop down arrows show back up. So that's the reason we're doing that. Now really the last thing we need to do on this front section is we need to come in here, we need to select our name group, and we just want to make sure it has a flex grow of 1, and that's just going to make sure it pushes this element as far to the side so our expiration is all the way on the very right hand side. Now, before we move on to the back section of the credit card, I want to get these little circle symbols showing up here. As you can see, we have these kind of like circle patterns showing up. This is actually super easy to do with CSS. To do this, you just want to select your element. In our case, it is the front element. And we're going to get a before and an after element. We're essentially going to do the same thing for both. Each one is going to comprise one of these circles. So to make the element show up, we need to give it some content. And we're going to do absolute positioning for these different elements. And I also want to specify a hard-coded height, in our case 400 pixels, and a width of 400 pixels, as well as a border radius of 100%. That's going to give us a circle. Now, in order to make the circle have some color, we're going to use HSL again. We're going to use our hue of 0. Hue doesn't really matter. Our saturation is 0, so it's going to be essentially a gray color. And 100% lightness means that we have pure white. Now, if I just give that a quick save and I come back over here, you can see we have this giant white circle. Well, we want it to be partially transparent. So I'm going to say 0.15 as our opacity. And now you can see that it's showing that blue color, but it's just a lighter version of the blue color. Now all I need to do is position it in the correct location, which in our case is going to be negative 250 pixels in the top direction. And we're going to do negative 150 pixels left. There we go. And then Z index here, I'm just going to set to -1 just to make sure that it doesn't interfere with my inputs, because without that, it could show up over top of my inputs. Like right now, I can't click on any of my inputs unless I'm outside of that circle. So the Z index -1, just make sure it shows up behind the inputs. I could do like pointer events none as well, but this works just fine. Now I'm going to copy down this code because the after element is going to be very similar. We just need to change our sizing. For example, in our case, we're going to use 600 pixels of size. We're going to make this one a slightly more transparent color, so it's going to be a little bit darker looking, essentially is what it's going to appear like. And here for our position, we're going to go off of the bottom. So we're going to say negative here, 475. And for our left, we're going to do the same, negative 150 pixels. And if I save real quick, and I make sure that this is a negative number, you'll see that we now have that other circle showing up on our screen, and it just looks really cool. And it's, again, super simple. It's just a few lines of CSS to do this, and it makes the credit card look so much better. Now, the last section we have to work on is the back of our credit card. So we can come in here to get our credit card. I want to get the back section, and automatically we need to position this absolutely to get it where we want it to go. So we're just going to say our top is 2 REM, and our left is 3.25 REM. And as you can see, we now have that positioned where part of it is showing on the right of the screen, which looks really good. Now what I want to do is I want to get to the stripe section. That's just going to be that black line that we have right here. I want to add some styles for that. So for our background color, we're going to do that same HSL. We're going to do 280% as our saturation and 10% as our lightness. So it's going to be a pretty dark version of the blue color we've been using. Now for our height, let's do 35 pixels. We're going to absolutely position this. So absolute position, left side is 0, right is 0. That just makes it fill 100% of the width. And our top is 1.5 REM. Now if we come over here, you can see now we have that black bar showing up, which looks really good. Now, one of the last things we need to do here is just get our credit card CVC group, and we need to select our actual credit card CVC input, these two different selectors. So for the group, if we go back to our HTML and we scroll all the way down here, you can see that we have our group right here, and on our input, let's just give it a class of CVC input, so we can position our input and our group properly. So for our group, what I want to do is position it absolutely. And this time I'm going to be basing it off of the bottom, and I'm going to use 3.25 REM. Now you're probably wondering where I get this value from. Essentially what I'm doing is I want to position this input. Also, let's get our right, which is just 0.5 REM. As you can see, now that's showing up perfectly in line with the rest of our inputs. So to calculate this value for our bottom, all I'm doing is I'm taking my top value here, which is 2 REM. That's how far down this back is from the top portion. So the back is 2 REM lower than the front. So automatically I need this to be 2 REM to make sure that offset is taken care of. And then we have our padding on the bottom, which we manually set all the way at the very top here to 1.25 REM. So if you add those two numbers together, you get 3.25 REM, so they perfectly line up. Now to make our input the right size, we're going to use that same 3CH, and I'm going to use, again, a font family of monospace. And now you can see our CVC shows up right here, and we can put 3 numbers in there perfectly. Now, if we do a quick comparison, you can see that these look almost identical, but you'll notice there's no border on our version. I must have done something wrong with our border. So if we scroll up here, you can see I never actually specified a size. So we'll say 1 pixel solid. There we go. And now that gives us a border. And now if we compare these two, they look identical, which is great. So now with all of that done, we can actually move on to our JavaScript portion of this. And this is where some of the really tricky code is going to come in. I'm not saying the CSS was easy by any means, but this JavaScript is quite tricky. So let's come all the way up here. We're going to make sure that we link this script tag .js, make sure I defer that. If you're not really sure what the defer attribute does, I have a full video covering it. I'll link in the cards and description for you. But also what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this input for our year. I'm going to remove the options. I'm going to give it a data attribute called expiration year, just so we can select this in our JavaScript. So what I can do is I can say expiration, select equals document.query selector on that data attribute, which is data expiration year. Now, if you're curious why I actually use data attributes instead of classes, I have a full blog article covering that. I'll link in the description for you. Essentially, it just makes it easier to separate your CSS and JavaScript. Now, what I want to do is I want to get the current year, which I can do very easily by just getting a new date. That'll give me the current date. And I want to get the full year, and that's going to give me the current year that we're in. Then what I can do is I can do a simple for loop where I is equal to my current year. I want to check when I is less than my current year plus 10. And I'm just going to add 1 to I each time. Essentially what this is doing is it's going to loop through my numbers starting with the current year and going 10 years in the future. And I just want to create an option for each one of those years. So document.createElement, an option. Our option is going to have a value, which is our I. It's also going to have, option.inner text, which is also I. And then inside of my select, I want to append that option. Now with that little bit of code, you can see now we have essentially the next 10 years available for our expiration dates, which should be more than enough for any credit card. Now that right there was the easy part of our JavaScript. The hard part is going to be making it so that our input properly works no matter what we type and however we interact with it. Now to do that, we need to select our inputs, and we also need to select our logo because depending on what number your credit card starts with, your logo is actually going to be different. That's just how credit cards work. So we have MasterCard and we have Visa implemented. You could implement more if you want, but those are the two we're going to do because the process is really boring to do multiple of them. It's the same exact thing. So we need to be able to select our logo as well as our inputs. So let's add some data attributes for those. First, we're going to come to our logo. We'll just say data logo, pretty straightforward. And then for our credit card inputs, instead of putting a data attribute on each input, I'm just going to put one on the wrapper. And this is a data attribute we're going to call connected inputs. And this is going to wrap all of our connected inputs. And the nice thing is if we have other connected inputs on our page, they'll all work as long as we give them all this data attribute. So now with that information, let's save, go over to our JavaScript. And I want to set up an event listener for key down. And this event listener is going to be on our document, which means we very first need to figure out, are we inside of one of the inputs that are for our connected input? So we can do that by just having a simple check that's going to say is connected input. We're going to pass it in the input we're currently typing into. And to get that, we can just say e.target. That is going to be equal to our input, just like that. So if we are not inside of a connected input, I just want to return. All this line of code right here is saying is only do this type of code that we're going to be running if we're inside of one of these connected inputs. Otherwise, just don't do anything. Do whatever you would normally do. It doesn't matter. So let's create this function is connected input, which takes in an input. Now we know that we gave all of these inputs a parent that has a data attribute of connected inputs. So if our input is inside of this div, we know that it is an input that is a connected input. So let's get the parent, which is equal to our input.closest. And we're going to pass it in the selector for that data attribute, just like this. Now we're trying to get the parent that has this data attribute. So now we can just say, hey, we need to return here. If our target.matches input, that means it's an input element, and our parent is not equal to null, then that means we're inside of a connected input. This essentially says we're typing inside of an input because our target is an input, and our parent, we were able to find something with this data attribute as our parent. So now essentially we are inside of a connected input. So that function right there, done, we can just minimize that. And if we are in a connected input, now we're going to do some fancy code. So for this code, first I want to get our key, which is just e.key. This is the code, the key that we essentially clicked on. And then I want to do a switch statement over that key. And we're going to have a default case, which is what we're going to do to handle anything like typing numbers, but also what happens if we use an arrow key or a backspace or the delete key. We need to handle all of those. So I'm going to have a case here for arrow left. And this is going to handle what happens when we hit the left arrow key. So inside this arrow left situation, I want to move to the left by one input. So like right here, if I hit left, you can see we've moved into the input that came before it. If we hit right, we're moving to the input afterwards. So we need to handle that scenario. But if I hit left while I'm in the middle of this input, I don't want to move unless I'm at the very edge of the input. So we need to not only check if we're at the edge of an input, but we also need to be able to move to the next input if that is true. So here I'm going to do a little simple check. We're going to say if input.selection start is equal to 0. That means that my selection currently is on the very left-hand side of my screen. But also, if I have highlighted something, my selection start and end are going to be different values. So I need to make sure that I don't have anything highlighted, which means my start and end of my selection are exactly the same. So if my input selection start is at 0 and my selection end is at 0, that means my cursor is at the very beginning of this number. If my cursor was here after the first number, essentially that would be a selection start of 1 and a selection end of 1. It's just an index based on where you are in that string. If I highlight, for example, these three numbers, well, the start of my selection is at 0, which is before the first input, and my selection end is at 3 because it's after the third element in that list. That's what this end and start is doing. So when I click the left arrow key, I only want to move to the previous input if I'm at the very beginning of my current input. So if both of these are true, then we can run some code, just like this. And I also want to make sure I do a simple break right here so we don't run any of the other default cases. So what I can do is I can get the previous input by saying input.previous element sibling. And that's going to give me the previous input because we've just added them all as siblings just like this. And then what I can do is I can say, hey, I want to focus on that previous element. So that's just going to focus me inside of that previous element, but I want to make sure that my cursor here goes to the very end of that input instead of actually somewhere else. As you can see, when I hit the left arrow key, it puts me to the left of the last element, which is exactly what I want. So I can say previous.selection start is equal to my value.length -1, and that's going to put me right before the very last element. I need to do the exact same thing with the end, and again, that's going to make sure that my cursor is in that exact right location. And then I'm just going to prevent the default because we don't actually want it to do anything else since we already did what we want it to do on our own. So if I just give that a quick save and I click the left arrow key, you can see nothing is happening, so clearly something is not quite right. Let's see if we have any console errors to worry about. It says target is not defined, is connected input. Let's scroll to that function. As you can see, I put target here instead of input. That should fix everything. Now it looks like it possibly fixed some things, but we have other errors. Let's see inside of here. Cannot read properties of undefined, reading focus. And this is right here, so it's not able to select our previous element. That's just because this should say previous element sibling, and hopefully that should all work. There we go. Now we can move to the left. And if we have some numbers inside of here, for example, and I click left, it's perfectly moving me only when I'm at the very end of my input. Now let's try to do the exact same thing for our right arrow key, and it should be almost identical, but we want to check to make sure we're at the end of our input and not at the beginning. So to check if we're at the end, we can get the value.length, and if the selection start and the selection end are both at the same position as the length of our value, we're at the very end of that input. So now here, we can get the next element sibling instead of the previous. So I'm just going to replace everywhere that I had previous with next. And I want to get my start and end value is going to be 1. And that's because I want to have my selection go to the very next input. So if we just type in some numbers here and I hit right, I want my cursor to essentially end right here. So let's hit right, and you can see my cursor ends right in between the 2 and the 3, just like we want it to, and this is working perfectly fine. Even if we have an empty input, for example, it'll allow me just to move into that and move to the next one. Now this is working great, so we can minimize these down so it's not in our face. But one problem that we run into is if I'm typing a number like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, you'll notice it only lets me put the first 4 numbers in, and then I have to click the next input to type in the next 4. That's cumbersome. I want it to be like this input, where if I just clear this out again, and I just type in some numbers, you can see it just flows to the very next input. This is where the most complicated part of our JavaScript is going to come in. So this is our default case. Anytime we type anything that's not in this case statement, we're going to end up in this default section. So first, I want to see, are we pressing the control key or are we pressing the alt key? If we're pressing either of those, just return immediately, because that means we're trying to do something like copy paste, select all. We're doing something special. We're not actually typing out numbers. So just immediately return, don't do anything at all. Next, I want to check to see if my key matches anything but a number. So if we have a match here, where whatever we typed in from the start all the way to the very end here, this is what this is saying, is something that is not 0 to 9, so not a number, then what I want to do is e.prevent default. So all this code right here does is a complicated regular expression, and if you're unfamiliar with regular expressions, I have a full video covering them linked in the cards in the description. But essentially it's saying, do we have a key that is not 0 to 9? If it's not 0 to 9, like we typed in an A or an S, just prevent default, which prevents us from typing those characters. If I remove this and I come over here, you can see I can type in things that are not numbers. But when we have this line there, I try to type in things, I'm typing right now a bunch of letters, it's not showing up. That's what this line is doing. It's preventing all of that from happening. Now, if all of these scenarios run perfectly, we now know that we have a number that is 0 to 9 somewhere inside of our input. So what I want to do is I want to prevent the default. I want to prevent this from actually putting the number inside the input because I want to take care of that myself. So I'm going to say on input change, I'm going to pass in my input as well as the key that we're typing in. And I want to create a function that's going to allow us to take in some value and it's going to put it on the screen perfectly fine. So let's do that function on input change with our input and our key. And instead of key here, I'm going to pass in the text of new value just so it's a little bit more clear what is happening. So inside of this function, we need to do essentially two different things. First of all, we need to put the number in if their number needs to be put in. And if we need to move to another input, we need to focus inside of that other input and place the number in the new input. So we kind of have to create the new input number and we have to focus on the new input if needed. So we kind of have like an update and then a focus section. So we can use two functions for that. We'll say update input value, and that's going to be a function that does something. And we're going to have a focus input function, which again is going to focus the correct input for us. Now, this new value could be more than just a single key. The reason for that is what happens if I paste in a large string. Let's say I have a bunch of numbers like this, and I want to paste those in like this. Well, obviously, I should probably paste it all the way along all of our forms. So this new value could be anything from one single character all the way to a massive list of numbers that we want to display on the screen. So we need to make sure we keep that into account. Also, what happens if I highlight some numbers and I type in 8? I want to make sure I remove the highlighted numbers and replace them with the new number. So we need to keep all of that in account when we do all of our updates. So because of that, we need to pass a lot of information to our update. For example, we need to pass in our start position, which is our selection start for our input. So here we can pass in our input, we can pass in our new value, we can pass in our start position, and let's also get our end position, which is just our selection end, and we're going to pass the end in here as well. So this tells us, okay, we are currently highlighting between these two different positions in our input. This is the value we want to add, and this is the input we want to add that to. That's what this code right here is saying. Now, we can actually write that function real quick. So we can say update input value, and this is going to take in an input, it's going to take in an extra value, a start, which by default will be 0, and an end, which again by default will be 0. Now here is where all of the crazy code is going to go. So the first thing I want to do is I want to replace the input value with a new value. So we can say our new value is going to be equal to some string interpolation where we have our input value. I want to use the substring function to return everything between 0 and our start location. So what this is going to do is it's going to get all of the input value that's not selected. So in our case, if we select the 1 and the 2, this line of code input.value.substring between 0 and start is going to return to us 8 because that's the thing that's not selected. Then what I want to do is I want to add in some code for our actual extra value. So all the new code that we're adding in, I want to add that in here. So if we type in the character 1, this is going to be the character 1. If we paste a 10 character long string, this will be 10 characters long. Then finally, what I want to do is I want to get the stuff after the section I've highlighted. So to do that, we're going to use very similar code. I'm actually going to copy this and paste it down because it's very similar. But instead, in starting at 0, we're going to start here at our end location, and we're going to go all the way up to the value of 4 because an input can never be longer than 4 characters. So if I give that a quick save, essentially what's happening with this new value, it's let's say I have an input that looks like this. Let's come over here, we'll type in a bunch of numbers, and I highlight these sections. And then I type the character 2. My new value is just going to be this. It's going to be whatever is left over after you delete everything that's highlighted and replace it with the new thing that you typed in. That's what our new value is going to be. And our new value could be something that's as short as 1 character, or it could be really long. For example, it could be more than 4 characters long. So we need to make sure we take into account all those different scenarios. So first, we can take our input dot value, and we can set it to our new value dot substring of 0 to 4. That's just going to take this new value and shrink it down to exactly 4 characters long, because it's possible we could have more than 4 characters when we do this. Then what I need to do is I need to check, hey, is this new value actually longer than 4 characters? If so, we need to add some new information to the next input. So if we have another input, for example, our next element sibling is equal to null, we return, return, there we go. And let's just call this next. Just like that. So if our next is equal to null, don't do anything at all. Otherwise, we're going to call this update input value function. I'm going to pass it in our next input. I'm going to pass it in our new value, but I want to do a substring here, and I want to get all the values after 4. So if we just come right now and we start typing, you'll notice that this is actually working. For the most part, it's not focusing properly, but you can see that it's adding things in. If I type in 222, 333, you can see it's adding all those numbers in the correct location. And now let me explain more how this code is working. So we already know what this new value is. Essentially, it's making sure that if we highlight something and type in 4, for example, it'll remove the stuff we highlight. That's really good. And then it's making sure we update the value of our input. So we're just getting the first 4 values from that new value, and that is our input value. So never longer than 4 characters. And then if our new value somehow is longer than 4 characters, for example, right here, if I type a new character, that's going to add a 5th character for my input. So it's going to overflow that to the next input section. So if this value is greater than 4, we get the next input and we just take our new value and we cut it off. We take the first 4 characters, remove them because we've already saved them in this input here, and then we pass the next 4 elements into this function. So for example, if we call this function with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 as our extra value, and our input is blank and our start and end are both at 0, what's going to happen is 1, 2, 3, 4 is going to be put on our first input. That's going to be right here. And then the second time we call this function, it's going to pass 5, 6, 7 as our extra value. It's going to put that into the new input, and then it'll no longer call the function because our value is no longer greater than 4 characters. That's essentially what this is doing right here. Now, after we actually update our input value, the next thing we need to do is focus on the correct location. Because as you can see, as I'm typing, my focus is not in the right input. It's not at the end of my string like it should be. So to do our focus, we need to make sure we have our input, obviously, so we can actually do our focusing stuff. But we also need to pass in the actual length of data we're updating. That is really easy to do. We just take our new value. We want to get the length of that, and then we're just going to add in our start location. So what this is going to do is it's going to tell us exactly what index we are going to be at inside of our input. So for example, if we're inside of this input right here and I hit the character 8, for example, what that is telling me right now is, okay, my start position is 2 because of where I'm at, and my length is 1, so 3 is essentially the number here that is going to be input into this function. Now, for example, if I tried to paste a large value, the number is going to be much larger than 3. And this is just trying to tell us what index we should end up at based on where we started. So whatever input we started at, in our case, we started at input 1, we added 1 value onto 2, so our end position should be 3. That's all that this is saying. So let's create that function now. We can just come down here. Function focus input takes in an input and a data length. And what I want to do is I want to just kind of chunk this by chunks of 4 because I want to find like the last chunk of 4 because that'll be the input we're currently in. So we're going to make a value called added characters. That's just going to be equal to our data length. And that's because we're going to be updating this value inside of a loop. That's why we're just redefining this here. Also, I want to get our current input. Current input, which is equal to our input. And then we're going to do a while loop to loop through this forever. So while we have more than 4 characters is greater than 4, and while current input.next sibling is not equal to null, we want to run this loop. So what this loop is saying is, okay, if we have more than 4 characters to add and our current input has another input after it, we should focus on the next input. So for example, if I try to paste in like 7 characters, well, that's going to be 9 as our value. So we should be focused inside of this input somewhere here. So let's just write this out. First thing I want to do is I want to subtract 4 from our added characters. So we can just say minus equal 4. That's going to reduce our added characters by 4. And then our current input is just going to be equal to our next input, which is our next element sibling. So this while loop is going to run until either our added characters somehow becomes less than 4, or we no longer have more inputs to go to. So if I try to paste in 100 numbers, obviously I can't fit those in 4 inputs, so it's just going to hit that point where there's no more inputs, and that's what's going to happen. So we're going to have an if statement that says, if our added characters is greater than 4, just change it back to 4, just because we want to make sure we highlight the very end of whatever input we're inside of. Then what I want to do is I want to take my current input, I want to focus it. So no matter what happens, whether we get to the last input or somewhere in the middle, we're always going to focus that current input. And then what I want to do is I want to take my selection start and my end, and I want to set it to the added characters, just like this. Now this line right here, the reason we did this is so that when we do our selection start and end, even if we try to paste 100 characters, it's going to make sure it always just selects the very end of our last input. And that right there should be all we need to do to make our focusing work. So if I type in 1, 2, 3, 4 and hit 5, you can see that my input is now over here. Same thing if I just do 6, 7, 8, again, you can see it bumped over just like it should. And this will work just fine with pasting as well, but we need to write some special code to make pasting work. So let's scroll up to where we have our input event listeners. I'm going to add another event listener, and this one is going to be for paste, if I can spell properly. There we go. And the first thing I want to do, just like I did with the other one, is I want to get our input, which is e.target.value, or just e.target. And I want to get our data, and the data is our clipboard data.get data, and we want to get the text that is currently copied to our clipboard. Then we can do a quick check to see if we are inside of a connected input. If we're not, just return, pretend this never happened. Also, we want to check to see if our value is allowed, and that's very similar to what we did up here. So what we want to say is, hey, does our data match essentially a regular expression that starts and ends? So it must be all numbers essentially. We want to start and end. Everything in there is going to be 0 to 9, and we can just use a plus to make sure that it's saying everything is going to be between 0 and 9. Again, if you're unfamiliar with regular expressions, don't worry about it. I have a full video covering them. It's linked in the cards and description for you. So here, if the value is not allowed, but we're inside of a connected input, well, I don't want to let you paste this because it's something that's not numbers, so prevent the default of that happening. Then what we can do is we can make sure that we also prevent the default of our normal paste operation, and we can say on input change, pass in our input and our data. So right here, we're just preventing the normal paste behavior from happening, and instead we're doing our own paste operation. So now let's see what happens. I'm going to type in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to paste that right here. You can see it perfectly pasted it, and it put my cursor where I need it to be. Now what happens if I take 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 5 threes, and I want to paste it right here, but I'm going to highlight 6 and 7. But when I paste, you can see 6 and 7 were removed. I had 5 threes put in place, and my cursor ended at the exact end of where those threes were pasted. All of our code is linking up to the point where now everything is working as we expect. For adding numbers, for doing our left and rights. Now we just need to make sure like backspace is going to work just fine, because if I click backspace, you see nothing happens. I want to make sure the delete key is working fine and all of that stuff. Also, one thing we need to fix is the way that this delete key is kind of doing some weird stuff. I want to make sure my regular expression here has a plus just to make sure everything does not match a number here. Now when I click delete, it doesn't add that text del, while when I did not have this and I clicked delete, it was adding that text. So we just want to make sure that we have that plus symbol in there. And actually, now that I think about it, this is actually going to break things like tab. For example, if I click tab, it's not working. So I'm going to do a little bit of a tweak here. So what I'm going to do is I'm first going to make a check to see if it's 1 character long and it is not equal to 0 to 9. If that is the case, I want to prevent the default. That means I type something like A or S or D or whatever. For this next check, I want to see, is it multiple characters long? If it's multiple characters long, then I want to do something different. So I guess an easier way to do that, I could just say if key.length is greater than 1, then just return and don't do anything. Otherwise, we can now do this check here to see if it is a single number. If it's not a number, prevent the default. So now tab is working just fine. If I click delete, it doesn't add the extra stuff, but numbers are still working fine, while letters are not working. So that's exactly what I want to do. Let's just make sure all the normal default behavior works just fine. So now we just have a few cases left. We have delete, and we have, whoops, a case here for backspace. Now our delete case is going to be very similar to arrow right, so I'm actually just going to copy everything from here, paste it in, but we're going to do some slightly different stuff because we need to modify our input. So if we are at the very end of an input, I want to delete the character from the very next input. So to do that, what I can just do is I can say I want to get the next element sibling. I want to modify the value here to be my next.value.substring. I want to go from 1 to next.value.length. This is just going to get all of the value except for the very first character it's going to remove. Then I want to focus, and I want to put my selection at the very beginning, so I want to use 0 and 0 here. So let's just type out some numbers, and if I click delete, and let's just say I come to the very end here, I click delete, it should remove the 3 and move my cursor to that input. And as you can see, it did exactly that, so this is working as expected. Next, we have our backspace code, which is going to be very similar to our arrow left. So I'm just going to copy the code from our arrow left. I'm going to come down into backspace. I'm going to paste that in. And again, we just need to do the same thing we did for delete, where we actually remove the value we don't want. So our previous value is going to be equal to our previous value.substring between 0 and our value.length minus 1. I just want to remove the last element from that. Then I want to place my cursor at the very end of that input. So if I just type in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, I click delete, or backspace, sorry, it goes back 1. I click backspace again, you see it removes the 8 and moves me back 1, and I can do this all the way through the input. Now the very last thing we have left here is to handle our changing of our logo. So we can just select our logo, by saying document.querySelector, data logo. And then right here where we have our onInputChange, every single time our input change, we call this function. I want to get the first 4 digits, which is our input. I want to get the closest data connected inputs. And then what I want to do is I want to get the first input inside of here, and I want to get the value. What this is doing is it's taking whatever input we're in, we're selecting the parent that contains all the inputs, and then I'm getting the very first input. This is just going to give me the first 4 numbers of our credit card. And the way that credit cards determine what credit card you're using, like Visa, MasterCard, Discover, is based on those first 4 numbers, generally just the first 1 or 2 numbers. So in our case, if the first 4 starts with a 4, well, in that case, then we are using a Visa card. So I can say logo.source is equal to visa.svg. Else if we have something that starts with a 5 instead of a 4, well, in that case, we are using MasterCard. So I can come in here and I can change my source for my logo to be mastercard.svg. So now if my very first number is a 5, you can see it's MasterCard, while if it's a 4, it shows up as Visa. And you could add in all the other SVG symbols, you just need to create a bunch of if-else's for them. Now the final thing I want to mention about this is that you probably shouldn't create a 4-part input like this. As you can see, it took us a lot of code inside this key down to make sure things work, and a lot of thought process went into me writing this code to make sure I had all the accessibility concerns and keyboard accessibility, but it's just always a bad idea because you're bound to mess something up. I guarantee you I probably messed something up in creating this input. So that's why things like Stripe, they just use one input and just do some special formatting inside that one input because it's a lot easier to work with, better for screen readers and so on. But for this particular project of trying to emulate the exact design that I saw, I wanted to make sure we tried this out. And honestly, it works really well and it looks really cool, which is really what matters for this project. Now, if you enjoyed this video, you're definitely going to love this video over here, which is where I create a CSS review widget. It has some JavaScript and advanced CSS tactics just like this video, so it's going to be a great project for you to do next. With that said, thank you very much for watching and have a good day.